Programming controls in PLSQL. Programming controls are really the controls in a programming language which allow you to communicate between different commands within a block of code. PLSQL has all the standard programming controls, namely an if statement, part of selection, a case statement, another type of selection statement, loop statements, a for loop, a while loop, and another type of loop which is really just called a loop-end loop. A loop-end loop can be either a while loop or an until loop. Sequence controls, which more sensible programming languages tend to avoid gotos because they can persuade programmers sometimes to create really horrible, undecipherable, non-maintainable spaghetti code. Avoid goto if possible. Null basically does nothing. You fill in gaps where you don't want absolutely nothing to be, like for instance inside a procedure that does nothing. A procedure doing nothing between a begin and end block will actually not compile, so you could put a null statement in there. Selection. Selection implies go and select one thing or another. This is the syntax for the if statement. It simply says if one expression is true, do something, else if a different expression, then do something else, and then the default, if all these options fail, is else, and you do something else as well. A case statement. There are two types of case statement. The first applies a search condition, and the second applies a selector and expression. Once again, it's a selection type of programming control. It selects something based on an expression or value. In this version of the case statements, the search condition simply says when this condition is true, do this, when that's true, do that, and again you have a default at the end. The selector and expression sets up a selector which will evaluate to a result, and this expression 1 and expression 2 will actually contain the when clause that would be applied to the result of that expression. In other words, you say case what if this happens, or a variable name, and you would actually have the value of the variable from the selector up there. Again, else for default. Iteration or looping. Here's the syntax of the for loop. Quite often for loops are syntactically different in every programming language. In Oracle PLSQL in particular, it just says for a value in lower value ... higher loop exit when at the end or the beginning or wherever you like. Generally, if you use an exit when option in a for loop, you probably shouldn't be using a for loop. You should probably be using a while loop or simply a loop end loop statement. The while loop. Traditionally, a while loop has the test condition at the top of the loop. It says while a value is something, or while a state or a condition is true, keep going. An until loop, on the other hand, which is not specifically coded in Oracle PLSQL, would actually have the exit when expression at the end. In other words, it executes until a condition is true. Remember, while is the test at the top, until is the test at the bottom. They do have very specific applications, and any programmer will tell you that all these different types of programming constructs actually all get used under very specific circumstances. That's why they all exist. Here's the loop end loop statement. The loop end loop statement can behave, as it says here, as a while loop with the test at the top, or an until loop with the test at the bottom. While executes while a condition is true, test first. Until will execute until the condition is true, test at the bottom, or test last. Sequence controls. Goto statements. Here's the syntax. If a condition is true, then go to a label. Down here, if a condition is true, go to a label. Label 1, label 2. I do not recommend using gotos. Avoid using gotos in programming languages, in any programming language, like the plague. You will end up with serious problems later on, unless you absolutely have to use gotos. When I went to university, we were taught to program in a language called Modular 2, which absolutely did not allow the use of gotos. It doesn't even exist as a statement in that language. The reason why was because every single programming problem can be solved without a goto. It simply can. There is no argument against it. It does get complicated, but that's the way to do it. Everything is all about recursion and iteration. It's not about jumping from one point in a logical structure to another one anywhere you like. That's what ends up being spaghetti code. It is impossible to trace. It ends up with lots of chunks in there that may not be used. It just gets way too complicated over a period of time. If you have multiple programmers and multiple coders, they all have their different styles. Go-tos and use of go-tos will confuse everybody, and you will end up with a big problem eventually. Another sequence in Oracle is the null statement. It simply does absolutely nothing. One good use for it is when you're trying to trap an exception and trying to stop that exception from being passed up to the calling block or calling procedure or application. Tell it to do nothing. All it will do is trap the exception and say, oh, I'm going to do nothing, and it will actually go back to the next line from where you started.